Oh, speaking of favorites. Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Heather and as always I'm reading with a vengeance and I hope you are as well. Happy New Year! I hope everybody had a wonderful holiday season. I'm wishing everybody wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thoughts for the new year. So 2022, what a year, huh? So sum up for me. I read a bunch of books. There were some changes. I moved, we sold our house. We moved into a fifth wheel, so we're tiny living right now. It's somewhat temporary, but still big change. Other big thing for me for 2022 is I started this channel. So I'm really happy to still be here. Having this channel and doing this booktube thing has been just such a joy in my life. It has been so much fun. I've met so many wonderful people. And what really makes this particular video so exciting and so neat was that the very first video that I published on my booktube channel was my favorites of 2021. Now, full disclosure, it is December 29th as I'm filming this. I was going to wait until after the new year began so that I made sure that all the books got a fair vote. And I am reading my very last book of the year and I'm about 1/3 through it and I could just tell I don't dislike it or anything. It doesn't have that je ne sais quoi that would make it to this list. Now, another thing I want to say about this list, when I made my favorite 21 books of 2021, I thought that was kind of catchy, but I thought it was 2021, 21 books. It rolls off the tongue, right? I remember saying to myself back then, I'm not going to be able to do that every year, 22 and 22, 23 and 23. It's just, that's not going to be feasible. But I got down to 23 and then I was able to get it 22 and I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do 22 in 2022. It's just so cliche. I was trying to go along the list to try to cut the last two. It was like being in a lifeboat and I'm trying to select my favorite family members and friends to go into the lifeboat from me off of a sinking ship. I couldn't do it. So there's 22 on this list. These are all my favorites. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time explaining the synopsis of each book because I've already done that in wrap-up videos. The yammering is going to be about how much I love these books. Editing Heather is going to have her work cut out for her. And let's talk about order. Let's talk about ranking. As difficult as it was just compiling this list, coming up with the 22 favorites that made this list, to rank them, it just wasn't going to happen. I looked at my list finally and I'm like, okay, so what's number 22? No, that's not going to happen. However, I have a top 7 that were absolutely creme de la creme, close to my heart. I would recommend these to anybody. If I were a rereader, I would reread these books. These have all of my heart. They're my ride or die top 7. Then I have my top 3 that at this very minute, they're like tied for first. I still, at this moment, do not know which one is going to be number 1. That's going to be a spur of the moment, seat of my pants. You're going to see it as it happens, how I rank my absolute top 3. For the first 15, no order. And then when I get to the top 7, those are definitely my 7 favorites out of the entire 22. And then my top 3, we'll see when we get there, which is my favorite of the year. So the last thing I'll say before we actually get to talking about books, if you've been watching my channel, you know that each quarter I did a video of my top 5 of the quarter of the year, with the exception of the final quarter. Obviously, a lot of those books have made it to this list, but I will say that some of those books that made my top of each quarter didn't make it to this list. What I did was when I looked down and I looked at this list of books that I read for the year, I went by feeling. But I will say that every book on this list is a minimum of 4 stars. 4, 4.5, 5-star books are on these lists. When it came down to my actual top 22 books of 2022, it was all about the way I feel about them now. All right, let's actually get to the books. We're going to start with stats. I know a lot of you really love stats, so let's talk about them. Let's talk about my grand total. I read a total of 161 books. I don't count my DNFs. I had 9 DNFs. I think that's pretty good. That's less than 1 a month, so I'm pretty happy with that. Oh, and let me say something else too. I've seen it on Bookstagram, I've seen it on Booktube. Some people poo-poo it when people are talking about, oh, I read so many books, and oh, you shouldn't say how many books you read because it almost sounds like you're shaming people for not reading that many books or whatever. I don't take it that way. If you love what you're doing, go to the rooftops and shout it out. I read 1,000 books. I knitted 1,000 sweaters. I collected 1,000 cats. I don't feel like it's about bragging. I feel like it's about giving perspective. This is how much I love this thing. This is how much I'm committed to it. Don't let anybody shame you. Shout it out. I will say that 161 books is the most books I've ever read in a year. To be fair, this includes graphic novels and short stories. Oh, another little tidbit. I don't think any of these books on this list were published in 2022. These are just books that I read in 2022 that are my favorite. I will also say, if I counted correctly, out of the 161 books that I read, 51 of them were audiobooks. 14 on this list were audiobooks. The fact that they were audiobooks added to what made them wonderful for me. Okay, back to the stats. Here's the pie chart for fiction versus nonfiction. And this is for all of the books that I read. But as you can see, 88% of my reading last year was fiction and 13% nonfiction. I'm pretty happy with the diversity of genres that I read last year. One of the great things about Booktube for me was that it really expanded my reading in terms of genre. But anyways, all of these crazy genres were included in my reading last year, and I'm pretty happy with it. But as you can see, thriller, mystery, contemporary, literary, and horror, and historical fiction were the top 6 genres of my reading last year. I thought this was an interesting one. Here's my most read authors from last year. Obviously, Stephen King was at the top. I got Ruth Ware on here, and we all know my history with Ruth Ware. I read 3 of her books: Adichie, John Grisham, Frederick Backman. From these favorite authors, Stephen King did not make this list. Spoiler alert, John Grisham made it twice. Here's the handy dandy graph of page numbers. You can see that 49% of my books that I read were less than 300 pages, but 43% were right in the middle there, between 499 pages, and then 8% of the books that I read last year were 500 pages plus. But my average page number was 295. Then we have ratings. Most of the books I read in 2022, I rated a 3-star. 43 books I rated 3-star. And as you can see, which I'm really, really happy with this, is most of the books that I rated were 3-star and above. And it looks like my average rating of the year was 3.5 stars. I always like this little thing that Goodreads does. They might not do the graphs, but they show you the book that you read that was the highest rated on Goodreads. For me, that was Chanel Miller's Know My Name. That average rating on Goodreads is 4.72. Stellar, as it should be. The lowest rated that I read last year was also one of my low rated, and that was The False Friend by Mila Goldberg. Shortest book that I read last year was Day Tripper by Fabio Moon. The longest book was Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. The other fun thing that Goodreads does is it shows you which book of yours was the most popular, I guess the most shelved on Goodreads. And for me, that was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. Not on this list, by the way. Okay, that's it for the stats. Let's talk about the book. So while I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the synopsis, I'm just going to give a snapshot about the synopsis, but what I will do is I will offer 1 or 2 books that if you've read and you liked, then you will like this particular book. Or you can flip it around. If you've read the book that I'm talking about from this list, then you'd like these other 2 books. I hope that makes sense. All right, now let's get to the books. The first one I'm going to talk about is one that I just read. It's the one and only book from December. It made it by the skin of its teeth, and that is The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. Historical fiction book that takes place in the 1950s, and it follows Emmett, who's a 17-year-old boy who's just been released from a juvenile detention center. He goes home to find out that his father has died. He is left to care for his 8-year-old little brother, Billy. He decides to move from, I believe, Nebraska, go on this road trip towards California where Emmett wants to start a brand new life, just him and his brother. Except he gets waylaid by 2 other inmates Duchess and Wooly, they escape and go on this ride, and all of these obstacles come up. This was a fabulous book. Books similar to The Lincoln Highway would be Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward or This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger. Next on this list is A Keeper by Graham Norton. This is a mystery about a woman who, after her mother's death, goes back to Ireland to sort through her affairs and ends up learning about the history of her mother and her father. And she learns why her mother never talked about her father. And there's this crazy story in her past, and it's fantastic. You will like this one if you loved Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers or The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. Next up is Descent by Tim Johnston. This one took me by surprise, and I remember talking about this one and saying that I almost DNF'd it at first because it had quite a slow beginning. But needless to say, I'm so glad I didn't DNF it. I absolutely loved it. This is also a mystery about a family who go on vacation into the Rocky Mountains. One morning, the daughter and the son go into the woods for a run, but only one of them comes out. You spend the bulk of the novel just kind of following how this tragedy affects each family member individually. And there's a couple of side plots that are super fascinating. It started off slow, but the character development was stellar, and it ended with a bang. You'd like this book if you liked The Island by Adrian McKinty or Wicked River by Jenny Melchman. The next book on this list is The Dutch House by Ann Patchett. This is contemporary fiction that follows a family over 5 decades, specifically Danny and his sister Maeve and their connection to the house that they grew up in. The dialogue in this book is the shining star. Now, I listened to this book. It was narrated by Tom Hanks, and I think his narration really added to my enjoyment. I think you would like this book if you liked The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett or The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. Next on the list is One Good Dog by Susan Wilson. This is a contemporary fiction about a man who has everything but then loses everything after he loses his temper at work. He's made to work at a soup kitchen where he mingles with people he wouldn't normally mingle with in his regular life. And he also meets and adopts a dog. And these two things come together to teach him compassion and understanding. And all of this culminates in him learning a secret about his past that led to him losing his temper in the first place. I found what made this book unique was that one of the perspectives that you get is from the dog. And really, you will love this book if you like any story about the relationship and connection between humans and animals. Next on this list is The Trespasser by Tana French. This is the 6th in the Dublin Murder Squad series. Now, you don't have to read the books in this series in order or at all. They all are perfectly good standalone books. And I have to say, out of the 6, up until I read The Trespasser, the very first one, In the Woods, I believe, was my favorite, and now The Trespasser is my favorite in the series. This is a mystery about a woman's death that on the surface looks like your average run-of-the-mill domestic violence, but you follow detectives Antoinette Conway and Stephen Moran as they uncover elements of the case that powerful and dangerous people don't want uncovered, and the detectives start to believe that there's more to this case than meets the eye, and there is. You'll like this book if you like the Cormoran Strike series by Robert Galbraith or the Armand Gamache series by Louise Penny. Next book on this list I'm so happy to talk about. I just read this one in November, and that is Blood Sugar by Sasha Rothchild. This is a suspense thriller that follows Ruby, who you know from the get-go is a serial killer. She's trying to find a way to prove herself innocent of a crime she didn't commit, while at the same time trying to avoid being caught for crimes that she did commit. And it gets to be a sticky situation for her. It's super fast-paced, it's funny, it's engaging, you immediately connect with Ruby. I had such a fun time with this book. You'll love this if you enjoyed The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead or The Things We Do in the Dark by Jennifer Hillier. Next is The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley Heller. I read this book because I did the whole Women's Prize for Fiction list, and it made the long list this year, and I felt like it was robbed because it didn't make the short list. This is literary fiction that follows Elle, who is a happily married woman, a mother of 3, and you get to learn all of the decisions that she's made over a lifetime that lead her up to the day that she sleeps with her longtime friend Jonas within shouting distance of both their respective families. I listened to this one. I absolutely loved it. I wish it had made the short list, but at least it made this list. You'll like this one if you liked Apples Never Fall by Leanne Moriarty or Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. The next one on this list is Jar of Hearts by Jennifer Hillier. This is the first one on this list that I'm talking about that is an absolute Booktube darling, so I probably won't have to say much about it, but it is a murder mystery that follows Geo and her best friends, Angela and Kaiser. They were kind of a trio best friend group in high school. Angela goes missing. Geo's boyfriend, Calvin, ends up later going to prison as a serial killer. Geo ends up serving time in prison because of her part in Angela's death. Kaiser grows up to be a cop, and when Geo is released from prison, she goes back home to live with her dad. Girls start going missing again, even though Calvin is still in prison. There are twists and turns in here that were so much fun. You'll like this one if you liked A Flicker in the Dark by Stacey Willingham or The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. Next on this list is Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby. This is a suspense thriller that follows Bug, who in his heyday was a getaway driver. But he's past all that now. He's an honest mechanic, husband, father, leading the good life, but then financial problems force him to take one last job. The job gets him into some big trouble with some big dangerous people, and it is a fast ride, pun intended, page turner. The characters are absolutely fantastic. The narrator on this audiobook was superb. If you get a chance to read this book, I highly recommend the audiobook. Just fantastic. You'll love this one if you liked Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead or Billy Summers by Stephen King. Next on the list is Fight Night by Miriam Taves. This is contemporary fiction told from the point of view of 9-year-old Swiv, who has been expelled from school, and she is living with her mother, her pregnant mother, and she's also living with her elderly grandmother, who is put in the position of homeschooling Swiv, and gives Swiv the assignment of writing a letter to her absent father. And in turn, Swiv asks her grandmother to write a letter to the child that Swiv's mom is about to have. And it's through these letters, these observations made by the grandmother and by Swiv, that you learn about the struggles from the past and how they affect the relationships of these three women. I also listened to this book, and it was beautifully done. It is funny and it's heartwarming. You'll like this book if you love Five Little Indians by Michelle Good or The Strangers by Catherine Vermette. Next up is We Begin at the End by Chris Whitaker. This is part mystery and part coming of age. This, for the most part, follows Walk, who is the town sheriff of a small California town, who is haunted by the fact that as a teenager, he helped send his best friend at the time to prison. Now, in present day, that best friend, Vincent, has been released from prison and he comes back to town. The story also follows Duchess, who is a 13-year-old girl who's kind of forced to grow up fast because her mother is irresponsible and self-destructive. And then a murder in town brings Duchess and Walk together. Let me tell you, Duchess is the star of this show. Her character is unforgettable and such a joy to read about. The story as a whole was just perfection. You'll love this book if you loved Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, which, by the way, was my #1 favorite book of 2021, or The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. Next on this list is the one and only nonfiction on this list, and that is The Storyteller by Dave Grohl. I listened to this, and it is narrated by Dave Grohl, and I can't imagine it being narrated by anybody else. Of course, it makes it much more enjoyable. I think all memoirs should be narrated by the author. But of course, this follows Dave Grohl in his rise to fame as a legendary rock star. Of course, he doesn't refer to himself as a legendary rock star. He just is one. This was just so much fun. Dave Grohl comes across as personable, and you just learn fun facts about the rock and roll world, which I just personally enjoy. You'll like this if you like any kind of celebrity memoir, specifically musician memoirs. This is just fantastic. And even if you don't, I think this is just enjoyable generally. If we're talking about fiction, I think if you liked Daisy Jones and the Six, then you would like this book. Next on this list is The Guardians by John Grisham. This is mystery, suspense, legal thriller that follows Cullen Post, who is an attorney and a minister, and he's the founder of an Innocence Project. And he takes on Quincy Miller's case. Quincy Miller has been wrongfully accused and convicted and sent to death row for murdering his own attorney. And the deeper Cullen gets into proving Quincy's innocence, the more danger he gets into, because dangerous people don't want the truth to come out about Quincy Miller's case. Super fast pace and Southern dialogue is just so much fun to read. You'd love this if you like the Harry Bosch series by Michael Connelly or the Jack Reacher series by Lee Child. Next on this list is November Road by Lou Berney. This is one of those books that took me by surprise. I just happened to have it in my library in my personal library, because a friend of mine sent it to me. She read it and she's like, oh, I think you'll like it. I loved it. This is historical fiction / suspense. It follows Frank, who is a lieutenant in the New Orleans mob scene, and he's on the run because JFK has just been assassinated and the mob has had something to do with it. They're getting rid of all the loose ends of people who might know something about it. So he's on the run. Then you're also following Charlotte, who is a mother of two who has left her husband and left her life behind to kind of start a new life. So she's on the run as well. Frank and Charlotte meet. They decide for reasons that they're going to ride together, and it is a fantastic story. Read this if you liked Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby or Love and Other Wounds by Jordan Harper. Okay, we're here. We're at the top 7. These are my absolute favorites. All the love that I have shown for the 15 books that I've just talked about, times that by 100, and that's how I feel about these top 7 books. In no particular order, we will start with the final revival of Opal and Nev by Donnie Walton. I think a lot of people were talking about this one when they were talking about Daisy Jones and the Six. It's similar in that it is kind of historical fiction in the music world, but this one is a lot deeper. It's a lot darker. It deals with heavier themes. And then it was picked for the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction. And then it was robbed for the short list. I was so bummed. But this is historical fiction. It follows the rise and dramatic fall of a Afro-punk rock duo, Opal and Nev. It's told multiple perspective, and also similarly to Daisy Jones, it is kind of an interview format. There's a journalist who is writing the story of Opal and Nev, and that format really helps the pages turn super quickly. Typically, historical fiction doesn't read like kind of thriller suspense, but it has that element, and I absolutely love that. But not only are you dealing kind of with the lightness of the music industry, but then there's these dark themes of racism and violence. Those two things coming together in such a brilliant way just makes for just a fantastic story. So it goes without saying, if you like Daisy Jones and the Six, but you want a little bit harder punch, then you'll like this one. Or The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Delilah Harris. Next up is a book that totally took me by surprise, and I absolutely loved it, and that is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. I think I had only barely heard of Becky Chambers through Booktube, and I picked this book because I did Chantel Reads All Day Reading Your Bookshelf Challenge for 2022, and the prompt for that month was read a book with, I don't know, like trees or leaves or some kind of greenery on the cover. And it was just a random pull off the shelf from my library. Didn't know a thing about it, had never even heard of the book, but it just met a prompt because of the cover. And I ended up loving this book so much. I haven't read the second one yet. I've had it. It's sitting right here, A Prayer for the Crown Shy. But there it is right there. This is a sci-fi fantasy. I would call it a novella. It's less than 200 pages, and it follows a non-binary tea monk who is kind of on the road searching for the meaning of life. They come across a robot who has decided to check on humans after robots as a whole have abandoned humans and decided to go on their own. And this particular robot is sent back to see how the humans are doing without them. And it's just a beautiful, heartwarming story about the human condition, and it's just a delight. I absolutely loved it. Can't wait to read the second one. You'll love this if you loved Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree or The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. This next one, anybody who's watched my videos will not be surprised because I went on and on about this book in multiple videos last year. And that is Wolf by Wolf by Ryan Groden. I love this book so much. I listened to it and it was fantastic. What genre is it, you say? Well, it is multi-genre. It is adventure, historical fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, crazy mix of genre. But it takes place in an alternate history where Hitler has won World War II. You're following Yael, who is a young woman who is a part of the resistance to try to defeat Hitler. And she's sent on this mission, which is a transcontinental motorcycle race, the winner of which gets to meet Hitler. So she's sent on this mission so that she will win the race, meet Hitler, and kill him. So much going on in this book, so much fun to read, page turner, brilliantly written. Can't recommend it enough. You will love this if you enjoyed Lovely War by Julie Berry or My Lady Jane by Cynthia Hand. Next on this list is another John Grisham, and this is one of the authors that made this list twice. Next one on this list is The Confession. This was the first John Grisham book that I had read in a long time, and I read a lot of John Grisham, and this one is probably in my top 3 all-time favorite John Grisham books. My very number one favorite John Grisham book is A Time to Kill. This one was so great. I also listened to it. It's very well narrated, action-packed, suspense. It just keeps you on your toes the whole time. This is a legal thriller that follows Travis, who brutally raped and murdered a young girl 9 years ago, but he got away with it. Instead, a young Black teenager with a promising future, Dante Drum, he was wrongfully arrested, convicted, and sent to death row for this murder. Now, Travis, who's just been released from prison for another crime, finds out that he is terminally ill. He wants to do the right thing by confessing to that original crime. And he's only got 4 days before Dante Drum is put to death for this murder. I could not stop listening to this book. It talks a lot about the death penalty, and regardless of what side of that argument you fall on, you will enjoy this book. You'll love this book if you enjoyed The 620 Man by David Baldacci or Beyond Justice by Joshua Graham. All right, here we are, my top 3 favorites of 2022. What order am I going to put them in? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Before I put them in the order I'm going to put them in, just know that these 3, really, they tie for first. But I've got to talk about them one at a time. So, tied for first place, I'm not going to say number 3, I'm not going to do it, is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. S.A. Cosby is the other author that made this list more than once. Razorblade Tears is everything. And let me tell you something else. I just watched a video this morning of a very popular, I want to say like over 100,000 subscribers, who put Razorblade Tears on her list of books that disappointed her in 2022. Somebody should check on her because she's not okay. Anyways, Razorblade Tears is a thriller that follows Ike and Buddy Lee. Ike is a Black man, Buddy Lee is a white man. They are not friends, but their respective sons were married to each other and they were murdered. So Ike and Buddy Lee come together and hop on the road to find out who murdered their sons and why. The dialogue between Ike and Buddy Lee is everything. So fantastic. But the story, I mean, just that synopsis should have you hooked. What's great about this story is you have these 2 men who are so different, not just because one's Black and one's white, but they lead entirely different lives. One of the threads they have in common is that they've both served time in jail. The other thing is that neither one of them accepted their sons for who they were and the lifestyle they decided to live, and they're both dealing with regret of not accepting their sons. Makes for such an amazing story. I absolutely loved it, and just written in in a thriller way about such important issues. Freaking brilliant. Read this if you enjoyed The Collective by Allison Galen or Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. The next book that is tied for first, sorry, total cop-out. It's my channel, I'll do what I want. Next, that is tied for first, is The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak. This one I read because of the Women's Prize for Fiction. This one did make the short list, as it should have, but I felt like it was robbed because I felt like it should have won. I read all 6 books on the short list, and while I enjoyed all of them, this one was my absolute favorite. I absolutely love this book. It's so beautiful. It's so beautifully written. It's such a beautiful story. This is historical fiction with a touch of magical realism. You are following Costas and Daphne as they meet and fall in love on the island of Cyprus during the Greek-Turkish conflict of 1974. They ultimately migrate to the UK. Years later, you are following Ada, their daughter, who is dealing with the impact of their parents' life and history. It's told on multiple timelines, multiple perspectives, one of which is of a tree. Sounds funky, sounds weird, it works. It's fantastic. Trust me on this. You will enjoy this if you like, I'm not going to get this name right, so please forgive me, Honor by Thridy Umrigar or Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. All right, the last book on this list, tied for first. Let's face it, if it's the last one I'm talking about, to be fair, it is my favorite of the year. If you've watched any of my videos, this will come as no surprise to you. Number 1 book of 2022, The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. I listened to this and it was absolutely narrated to perfection. This is historical fiction that follows the life of Cyril, who is born in Ireland, and you follow his life from the womb all the way through till he's in his 70s, and he moves from Ireland to Amsterdam to New York City, and you're just following his life, his relationship and friendship with his best friend, can't remember his name, and his feelings towards his best friend that are unrequited. Just all about his loves and his losses. And I'll tell you something, it is a beautiful story, and it's heartwarming and it's heartbreaking. There's tragedy, there's hardship, there's lightness, and through it all, there are laugh out loud, funny dialogue. Cyril is hilarious. He's got this dry Irish wit that is just written masterfully. Absolutely loved it. You will like this book if you enjoyed The People We Keep by Alison Larkin or Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. So that is it. Those were my favorites of 2022. It was a great reading year. What did you think about any of these books? Have you read them yet? Are they on your TBR? Have I just added 22 books to your TBR? You're welcome. What was your favorite book of 2022? I would love to know. Please feel free to write it down in the doodly-doo or just say hi. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.